understood by the very definition of the word, something guided by self-interest, politics, something that has a means to an end, especially based on self-interest. And so, is it lawful? Number one. Will it advance or improve the gospel? What we might add to it? Would it improve it? And then number three, is it expedient, which means that's guided by self-interest, by the political pressure, if you will. Would it be something that is based upon an end that is found rooted in self-interest? Number four, is it enslaving? Is it enslaving? Is it something that enslaves us? It's something that we cannot recover from, something that we cannot get out from under? Is it something that we can no longer live without? Is it enslaving? Verse 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient. There's our word we used last week. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Okay? So God has given us, he's talking about meats here, and he'll go on to talk about, thank you very much, he'll go on to talk about the power of overcoming sin, not allowing sin to reign in our body, but I will not be brought under the power of any. In other words, it may be in this world and it may be part of God's creation, but also it may be that is not something that I want to be involved in or with. And so, will it enslave me? Will it cause me to be captured by it and I cannot function without it? Will it do that to me? We're primarily talking about the latest attack in two areas upon the church today, and you find it in areas that you cannot believe. I received a series of text messages yesterday. I could show them to you on my phone. They're still there. From my sister Gwen and her husband Fred, and Fred's the one we're praying for. And by the way, in one of her texts, she told me that Fred's now in remission. Went back for a scan, and everything right now looks real good, and I appreciate your prayers on his behalf. But she said they had, week before last, that the elders there had fired the preacher, and the preacher had left, and over 400 of the members in that congregation left with him. And now they're thinking about starting a congregation in the Windsong area, which is a place outside of Sherwood, Arkansas. In the little community, it's not a little community, but it's called Wind as in the wind blows, Windsong. It's in keeping with those Indian names in that particular area, you know. So they have that area, and I thought to myself, 400, they could easily start a congregation. But you see, this thing has hit, and this is Pleasant Valley Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it's poor, weak leadership that gives in to the demands of the majority. And the preacher said, I can't go with this. This is the New Testament church. And so they said, well, you're fired. He'd been there 15 years, and he's fired. So they fired him, and the members that want to stay with the simple New Testament pattern, they've all left. And now there's going to be apparently a Windsong Church of Christ in the Windsong community. And I told Gwen, I said, that may not be all bad. I said, I hate a split. I hate a split with passion. But I said, if it's a split away from will worship, then it has to be. And besides, that particular area of the country there has needed a congregation of the church for years and years. People have to drive all the way to North Little Rock, or all the way out to Seven Hills, or all the way over to Jacksonville, and this way they would have a church in that community. So it may be a good thing. But brethren, this is happening every day. This is happening Gary and Denise, several weeks ago in Ruidoso, they were there the day it was announced. They were there. This is not something far from us. This is happening every day. It's happening every day. And the reason it's happening is because of leadership. You know, Paul said concerning the church that some shall lead away to the disciples after them. You know, and he's talking about the eldership in that particular situation. I understand the Ruidoso thing better, the preacher there at fault, because he's a communication major. And that's what we go to college now to get. If you go on the ministry, you get no help at all. Just like Mike went through LCU, he had no help at all from the college situation, from the finance office, nothing, because he was ministry. And since they took on the federal banana, they could not support the preaching part of the Christian college. And so the preaching students are there on their own financially, you see. But if you want to get around that and still preach, then you become a communication major. And you take Bible courses, survey courses, and things of that nature, but you're a communications major, and then you graduate and you go to a congregation to preach. And what that means is you have no real Bible depth. That's what that means. No real Bible depth. It's not like having a BS or a BA in Bible, or a MS or MA in Bible. It's a communication major, and it means you have scanned books of the Bible, but you really hadn't even done any in-depth study. So there's why you have that type of situation develop, because the preacher there doesn't know the book. And the preacher at Pleasant Valley knows the book. He stood up against the leadership, and he gets fired. So that's that situation. Now, John 8 and verse 38, let's look at this passage. This is going on, as I said today. We're not talking about something in a, like that old joke used to be, well, boy, you can't preach against that. Well, next Sunday you preach, and well, you can't preach against that. Preached against tobacco, and the brethren. I grew up in an area where people grew tobacco, in the hill countries and stuff where my dad preached, they had tobacco allotments, And, you get up there and preach against tobacco, and, and then, so then some brethren ran stills, preach against alcohol. And finally the preacher said, well, what can I preach against? And the elder said, well, let's think a minute. How about witch doctors? They're thousands of miles away, So you could preach safely against witch doctors. Well, we can't do that anymore because the witch doctors are here, okay? They're here. Now, in the book of John, chapter 8, the Lord is in a fiery discussion with the Pharisees, fighting them in their work. And what he says in this, he says in verse 30, let's just back up and get it. He said in verse 36, if therefore the Son shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. For I know that you're Abraham's seed, Yet you seek to kill me, because my word hath not free course in you. I speak the things which I have seen with my Father, and you also do the things which you heard from your father. All right, so there's a difference here. All right, help me out. He said, I have seen things, and I speak of things from my Father. Now, you are speaking from your Father. Now, I know that we are descendants of Abraham, but we have two different fathers here. I'm speaking from my father, and you're speaking from your father. All right? Now, who is, in the context, who is their father he's referencing? Say it again. Satan. That's what he's saying. See the context? He said, you are your father, the devil. All right? Are they religious? Talk to me. Yes. Who are these people? Yeah, they are religious. These are the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes know the book. The scribes know the book because they're the copyist. And when you write something, and how many of you, when you're, guy, this didn't happen to you, but it may have happened to some others. Did you have to go to the blackboard and write, I will not do 20 times? You never had that happen, I know. Is that right? And you stand up there and said, I will not laugh at the teacher, 25 times, right? If you write it enough. I had a science teacher, and he was also a football coach, which means there was very little science being taught. And he drew plays on the blackboard and diagrams of football plays and stuff. And so I was lucky to get out of there with a D- in science. But he had us write the principles in each chapter. He had us write each one of them 10 times and turn that in every day. So while he was talking football, we had to copy these principles of science in the back of the chapter, and there was usually like 10 of them, and they were 3 or 4 sentences long. We had to he used a notebook every day, seemed like, one of them spiral notebooks. And you had to turn that in, and what we were doing is teaching ourselves, you see. But if you write it down enough, what do? Yeah, you retain it. So the scribes knew more of the sayings of the law, you see, than the average Pharisee, Sadducee, or the people. They did. They knew the book, but they weren't applying the book. And Jesus said, I'm speaking the things of my Father. Now, they're claiming Abraham as their father, but the Lord said, you're speaking the things of your Father. And so when we start into this will worship thing, there's a difference in fathers. See the point? What does God say versus what you say? And then, ere very long, we become enslaved to that kind of thinking. And once, it's like I've heard people in our community where you and I live, I'm talking about Matador, Motley County, and they lament the fact that they used to go to worship service and all they had was the piano, and it was a beautiful worship service, say they, and now they can't hardly stand it because they've got, electric guitars. They have, name me some other instruments. Drums, and the drum gets the blood working, That's the reason the drums are so popular among the heathen, in the heathen country, because it talks to the sensual of the body. It does, and that's why we get the beat, That's why it works. And so we add all of this stuff in, and some of these people say, we don't like that. And how can we stop that? Judy Ann's stepfather and her mother and her brother, Ronald, was a song leader, and that is right, isn't it, babe, Ronald? And they were for years, 20 years over at Harmony or better, longer than that, wasn't it? Charlie was a deacon, 40-something years, and they come in with the drums and the harmonicas and the banjos and all of that, and Charlie says, we can't do this. If you only do this, go down the highway to the Pentecost, because we just use the piano. You see, he had no standard of Bible argument. He had no standard to say the Bible says you cannot. He couldn't say that because it already allowed an intrusion, and it had become enslaving. The congregation would not forsake any of it. You see, any of it. So once it comes in, it enslaves the mind. Once it comes in, you can't do without it. You see, you cannot do without it. It becomes an enslaving thing. And it owns you, and you can't think of not doing without it. Without it. I can name Monterey Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas. One, it used to be right. It used to be arm in arm brothers with Sunset. I remember that. Brother Nat Cooper, one of our instructors at Sunset, was the pulpit minister at Monterey. Strong preacher, powerful preacher. Couldn't hold it. And now you can go down the hall to this room, or they'll meet at 9 o'clock for a traditional service, and 100 or 150 people show up for that, and then at the regular service at 10:30 or whatever time it is, 9:45 or whatever, then you have, the 1,500, 2,000 show up. So it embeds the mind, and it becomes something that enslaves. It's something that we cannot do without. Therefore, you can say accurately, you are speaking from your father, the devil. The devil. Remember, the uniqueness of the New Testament church is found in its simplicity. It can be practiced by any group of people anywhere on the face of the earth. My son, he's in Panama. He sent me a bunch of pictures on the phone. Phone won't work as call, but it'll text and send pictures. And he sent me one last night, and he said, Dad, from Pan Am to this. And you know what it is? It's 3 logs tied together with his pack and stuff for the mission trip, and a pole laid across it. That's what it is. From Pan Am big jet, 757 jet, to a pole standing on 3 logs. All right? The day before he sent a picture, and they were all paddling in a pyro. You know what a pyro is? That's a log burned out. And they're all sitting in that thing. There's 5 of them in it, and they're all breathing through the middle of their mouth. Because if you breathe sideways, the thing will turn over, So they're all paddling, breathing too, and Mike's paddling too, and he's got one of them deals you punch on your phone, and it shows them working. And they're going up this tributary to this river to meet with the church. And then the next 2 or 3 slides, the church is just an awning, and it's wooden benches like you make out of 1x12s. And there's about 15 benches. And then the church met, and they had potluck. And they got one of those big old cast iron. James, you still have those pots? Yeah. How many gallons is that, James, you think? Yeah, big old cast iron pot. And a woman is stirring something that looks cross between a mulligan stew and a goulash. And guess what she's stirring it with? And Mike said, Dad, under that. He said, can you believe this? She got one of the paddles out of the boat and she's stirring that goulash. Yeah, she got one of the paddles out of the boat and she's stirring that goulash or whatever it is to eat. And the church is together and they're all going to eat out of that. And this woman, she's, middle-aged, probably 50, 55 so, and she's stirring that with that boat paddle. Now, he showed me pictures of the river. And the river is too thick to drink and too thin to plow. So it's not one of those fast-moving, sparkling brooks, like in Idaho where I raised him and his mother and I raised him and the kids and the sparkling brooks. You could just get a glass of cold water out of that thing. This looks like, the Pease River up here when it's in flood, or the Red River when it's in flood between us and Oklahoma. I mean, it's a silt-laden, sluggish, crocodile, snakes, all of that kind of river. Piranhas, you don't go swimming in the river. You thrash around in the water and the piranhas all come. You don't do that. That's where he's at. And the point is that they can meet there in that arbor thing. They can sing songs. They can worship. And there's not one of them there that has to play something, that has to have the knowledge how to play something. See? Because the simple New Testament church was designed in such a way that it could go anywhere. And wherever people are meeting, they can worship acceptably. The trappings of the law made such a burdensome thing. Do you realize that a faithful Jew has to make the trip to Jerusalem? If they live further than 15 miles away, they had to make the trip once a year to Jerusalem. Okay? To be a faithful Jew. That's why in Acts 2, there were devout men dwelling there from every nation under heaven. The Bible says, you see? So it's important. And all the trappings of Judaism, if they couldn't bring their goat or bring their lamb or bring their turtle doves, whatever the particular situation called for to worship, then what did they do when they got to Jerusalem? Purchased it. That's why there were money changers at the temple. But they were charging exorbitant prices to take somebody's dollar and make it into, pesos or pesos into dollars. They were charging a tremendous fee for doing that. It wasn't wrong that they were changing the money, but it was wrong the way they were doing it. Okay? So the trappings of the law were left behind in the new covenant in the simplicity of the New Testament church in the arena of the spiritual. You don't worship anymore. We're in John, aren't we? Let's look at chapter 4. Okay? Verse 19 is where it starts. Now these things enslave us when we start trifling with the package of the New Testament church. Remember, Paul said to the Romans in Romans 6 and verse 17, 18, but thanks be to God, whereas you were, but now you have obeyed from the heart. You were sinners, but now you've obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine, that pattern of doctrine whereinto you were delivered. So there was a pattern given them how in Rome to worship like they worshiped in Antioch, or how they worshiped in Pisidia, how they worshiped, in Derbe or other places. You followed that form of doctrine. The word form there comes from the word which means exactly that. Like you and I build a form to pour concrete. We understand what a form is. If you pour the concrete in the form, then after it dries, it looks like what the form intended it to be. We understand that in John 4, verse 19. The woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. All right, because now she's come to the understanding that I am in a spiritual discussion. Our fathers worshiped in this mountain. She's talking about Bethel. And you say, all right, here's the contrast. Where do we worship? Where? Where? Remember that word. W-H-E-R-E. Not who, where. Okay? Now, our fathers worshiped in this mountain. And you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. All right, so she has in mind the trappings associated with worship according to the law of Moses. You say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship. Jesus saying to her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem, the mountain by the name, it's not Bethel. Bethel's the town. The mountain is Gerizim. Nor in Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. Uh-oh. That's two places that are written off right there. Not going to worship here, and not going to worship down there in Jerusalem. Okay? Not going to do it. That's going to eliminate Judaism, isn't it? Because it's not going to be in Jerusalem. Okay. You worship that which you know not. We worship that which we know. See, they're worshiping the bulls. Remember the two calves that were put in place up there. We worship that which we know. For salvation is from the Jews. The gospel came through Jesus Christ from the Jews. But the hour cometh and now this is it. The moment's arriving, see? When the true worshiper shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So you're not in Jerusalem. You're not in Bethel. You're in the Spirit. So here's a new place, a new dimension. All right? Now, some people have said, well, that means in proper attitude. All right? But when the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshiper shall worship the Father in the right attitude and truth, for such doeth the Father seek to be his worshipers. God is an attitude, and they that worship him must worship him in the proper attitude and truth. You see, that don't work. It won't work. Why? Because it's talking about where. So it's talking about a new place. And the new place is the spiritual dimension. And that's what Paul said in Acts 17, isn't it? When he said, you even have an idol here to an unknown God, but I'm going to tell you about the real God. For in him we live and we move and we have our very existence. He's talking about in God. There's the dimension, okay? That not at the altar at Jerusalem, not with the two calves, the bulls at Bethel and Gerizim, not there. All right? So we're going to worship in the Spirit in that dimension, which means we can do that anywhere. See, dimension. That's what John 4:19 and the verses following is about. It's worshiping in a new place. Because she asked him, where are we going to worship? In Jerusalem or in this mountain? And he said, we're not going to worship in a place anymore. You see that? We're not going to worship in a place anymore. But we're going to worship God in spirit. So the trappings then of the world do not belong in the spirit. All right? And therefore, to add instrumental, man-made music into the worship Because I think it's better, that's will worship. Because I like it, that's will worship. Because I think it helps, that's expediency, that's will worship. Okay? That's Colossians, remember. I'm getting this word right out of the book of Colossians, chapter 2, where Paul condemns will worship. That's those trying to add what they think to the worship, okay? You know, the new moons and the seasons and the et cetera, he talks about there. And so what you have is the fundamental reason that you do not add something of this world in worship is because we are worshiping in the dimension of the Spirit, and it is a violation of the spiritual realm. If you don't see that, raise your hand. It belongs to this world. It does. Y'all see on the news where a woman got in a fight with the United Airlines people because she had a violin that was made in the 1700s. Y'all see that? They told her she had to check it. She couldn't carry it on the plane, violin. Nathan, how big is a violin? Weigh 200 or 300 pounds? But it's a little thing you can put in the overhead. But they wouldn't let her on with it. And she said no. And they fought her over it, bruised her hands. You know, you don't bruise an artist's hands. You don't do it. Now, my hands, they got walnut stain on the fingers that couldn't wash off because I'm working with a gun stock and sanding and staining, that kind of stuff. My hands, you could beat them with a hammer, and all I'd do is cry. Because, you know, but a violinist that's on a trip to partake of to be a part of a great musical event in St. Louis, Missouri, you don't hit her on the hands because her hands are what makes that music. And when you bruise her fingers, then she can't play. And they wanted to take her fiddle away that was made in 1700. You know? Huh? Well, she didn't go on that flight. She got her fiddle back and she caught the next plane. And but now there's a big deal with United Airlines. You know, those people, the airline industry, they've forgotten courtesies and all that stuff nowadays. Ever since the terrorist thing started years ago, and they think they own you, but the point is that fiddle, you know, I'll call it a fiddle, that violin is man-made. And I don't care how sweet the music out of it, it's still constructed by somebody's hands. And therefore, it's of this world. And so we cannot use the things that are of this world in the dimension of the Spirit. That's the whole point of New Testament worship. That's the whole point. Another tremendous illustration of that it's a fact, is we cannot take anything from this life to the next. We can't do it. You know, even in this country years ago, when the chief died, a Comanche chief, a Arapaho chief, Cheyenne chief, the Arapahos were the southern Cheyennes, but if a great, powerful chief died, what in the funeral service, what they normally do? They killed his horse, and it was buried with him, and his wife. Yeah, sometimes two of his wives. Yeah, so it wasn't a good thing to be married to the chief. He might meet an untimely end, and then your end is assured. And so you're buried with him. and his bows and arrows and, his musket or whatever, so he can have all of that in the happy hunting ground. You can't imagine him being in the happy hunting ground without his wife being happy, can you, Diane? Just can't happen, is it? Well, see, you got to have the wife. So. All right, so that's the way they thought. But nothing goes into the spiritual life, nothing of this world. Why do we add it in the most unique thing that God has ever given this world, and that is the body of Christ? You see, but what happens is it becomes enslaving. It becomes, you see, something we cannot do without, because we just can't once it starts. And so once it starts, then we have the drums and the banjos, and we have anything else you might want to add. And I could take a car horn and go and honk it. But what would keep me from it? Because you don't like it? Oh, no, you can't stop me, because I feel this is good, and it adds to it the way I feel, so I'm going to honk this horn. And you say, well, you're being ridiculous, preacher. And I am, but I'm illustrating a point. I go to the ridiculous to illustrate the point. So it's important for us to understand this. It is. And small we might be a number across the land, and diminishing more every Sunday, it seems like. But then when you stop and look at the crowd gathered around the cross that honored Jesus as the Son of God, it wasn't a big crowd either. It wasn't a big crowd either. I appreciate your attention. I want you to study this for yourself. This is no good if you cannot make this a part of your life. It's no good if I say it, and it's just because I say it. You need to study this and come to this conclusion yourself. And then you will never be swayed. Never be swayed. Okay? Study this. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.